Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Still We Persist. My name is Mia, I'm one of your co-hosts.
And I'm Shaina, the other co-host.
Yeah, and today we're really excited to introduce y'all to our series idea for this term. We have a lovely guest with us here today, and we'll go ahead and do a land acknowledgement, an introduction for the series, and then we'll get right into it. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and do a land acknowledgement for Corvallis, Oregon, because that's where I'm located. So here we go. Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampunefu Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of those people are part of the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians. And I'll go ahead and pass it off to my co-host.
Thanks, Mia. I'm currently in what is called Louisville, Kentucky, particularly the Jeffersontown neighborhood, which includes the homelands of the Shawnee, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Adena, Osage, and Hopewell people. Through various actions by colonizers, most people from these nations were forcibly removed over time. However, many members of these peoples remain in Kentucky, and they are the traditional stewards of the land I'm working from today.
Thanks, Shaina. I'll just give a moment to acknowledge that process. Okay. Welcome us back. So go ahead and introduce the series. So this term, Still We Persist, is going along with the theme of looking into a prism of feminist lenses. So what we really want to get at with this theme or these series of conversations is to share the experience and learn from and highlight some of the different intersectionalities of feminisms, looking at their specific approaches and perspectives, and bring along guests who really embody that work or can talk about that specific lens through their own work. And what a prism is when a beam of light is shown through it, it splits up into a rainbow of all different lights that make up that one beam. So that's kind of what we're getting at today. We're looking at one of the lenses, one of those colors that add into that greater whole. And we'll go ahead and just start off with a quote from Kimberly Cremshaw, who's known for their work on intersectionality. Just to further this container that we're building. The better we understand how identities and power work together from one context to another, the less likely our movements for change are to fracture. So I'll say it again. The better we understand how identities and power work together from one context to another, the less likely our movements for change are to fracture. And so we're looking at kind of a Chicana Feminism lens today, and hopefully that'll ground us in our understanding of feminism. And like Kimberly Cremshaw said, it's less likely that movements or change are to fracture. We have a solid understanding of how each of the differences come together. So with that, we'll go ahead and introduce our guest for today. We have Carina Tipton. Hello, hello.
Hi, I'm so excited to join you all.
Yes, thanks for being here, Carina. We really appreciate it and excited for this conversation today. We'll go ahead and just get started. So I'll go ahead and start off with our first question, just to like build conversation off of. And so we had talked to you previously, and you told us that you work at that intersectionality or at the intersections of Chicana feminism. That's kind of like what your work focuses on and what you've been doing for your work at OCU. So what does that mean for you, working at that intersection? And can you tell us a bit more about your work? And you can go into as much detail as you would like.
Yeah, of course, I would love to. Thank you. So, yes, my name is Carina. I use she, her pronouns, and the intersection of work that I have found myself in feels like it has been the same purpose for so long, for like my whole life. I kept thinking, did it start when I was in my master's program? Did it start when I was, 20? Did it start when I was in middle school? And the further back that I went, as far as I can remember, I think the ideas of my cultural understanding of stuff, my cultural understanding of how the world works, of right and wrong, good or bad, healing, harm, injury, is deeply informed from my Chicana and curandera background. I can share a little bit more about that if that feels good. And then my understanding of justice is incredibly familial. So thinking about how my parents and my grandparents experienced injustice, specifically like racial injustice, stuff with border patrol, education, a lot of stuff in education, educational racism, meant that my entire life having conversations about race and injustice were age appropriate, because I was often the age that my parents were when they were experiencing things. So in as early as third grade, really explicit conversations about getting in trouble at school and talking about the race and gender of the teacher that was getting me in trouble, because that was age appropriate, because that was how my parents experienced the world. And lastly, the third part of that is just my fascination with education as a whole. I have wanted to be, I was a kid that like lied about being sick so that I could go to school, right? I always wanted to learn. I always wanted to grow. And my parents really fostered that in me, whether it was like, we were really low income, but they were like, if it's a book, we'll get it. Don't, no questions asked. Like never feel bad for asking for stuff for school, never feel bad for asking for stuff for books. And that was the only way I could stay up past curfew if I was reading late at night. And so the intersection, I think, of all of those things, as I continue to grow up and see different ways that harm and injury were showing up, the different ways that justice and injustice were showing up, and the different way that education was showing up for me as a tool to empower me, but also as a site of violence, like as a site of like my way of seeing continued oppression and violence, I think kind of landed me here. So that's kind of where I am now. And so what I've focused on, I'm currently a PhD student in women, gender, sexuality studies at Oregon State University. And my concentration, what I'm focusing on, is called feminist institutional change. Because the idea is that I'm talking about can these institutions of violence, that if we talk about higher education, if we talk about systems of education, of prisons, of borders, of whatever these institutions that monitor and police individual human beings from like a government or state level, how can they ever be feminist? If they're classist, if they're racist, if they're sexist, if they're ableist, if they're all of those things, could they ever be feminist? And that's the heart of my inquiry. And the heart of my inquiry as a feminist is informed by being a Chicana, coming from a lineage of curanderas, coming from a lineage of, I don't even have the language yet, but like natural doulas, like we are birth workers at heart, in spirit. And so all of those things are informing when I say feminist institutional change. It might not be the feminist. I like that you use this metaphor of like the full light and then the breaking off of spectrums, because I think often when we think of like feminism, we think of like pink pussy hats and like bra burning and like lesbians with buzz cuts, which are all great things. I mean, we could probably critique a lot of them, but they're all great things. But when I think about feminism, it's deeply and inherently informed by Black, Indigenous, Chicana feminisms, healing feminisms.
So you talked about getting in trouble at school, and from having talked about these things with you before, it sounds like you weren't necessarily doing anything wrong. You were more maybe challenging teachers and administrators' ideas of like what your behavior should be. So could you talk a little bit more about the violence that systems like our mainstream education system, the forms of violence that they uphold, in feminist ways of healing from that violence?
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking a little bit to what does harm and injury look like in educational systems, and then how can my kind of idea around feminism respond to that? Thank you. I just want to be sure I mark those two so that I respond to them each. So the first one, when I think about harm and injury in educational institutions, I think of kind of like a 3-point system, right? So I think of like, first, there's actual physical harm, physical body harm that happens in institutions. So I'm thinking about the ways that we police hair, especially like Black hair. I think about the ways that we police, we reaffirm the gender binary of like girl dress codes and boy dress codes, but then violently so by making girls leave the classroom for wearing spaghetti straps, and how that inherently upholds young boys as unable to control their sexuality or something, or the male teachers, which is even darker, right? So there's like some physical harm, but then there's also physical harm that we hear about police presence in schools and like low income Black and brown schools, and so many other places, like actual physical violence of students being grabbed, students being thrown. So there's the physical piece, like actual, when we think of physical harm and injury. The other piece is like the harm and injury that comes at an interpersonal level that might not be as physical. So this is gonna be things like stereotypes that prohibit things like teachers believing that Black and brown students might not be ready for an honors class, or might not be seen as needing more rigorous homework, but seeing them as like bad behaving instead. That was something I got in trouble for a lot as a kid. I would finish my work and then I'd start talking, and then my teachers would get mad at me. And I'm like, well, I finished my work, you can't be mad at me. And so it wasn't until I found teachers, right, that were like, oh, you're just like smart and you want more to do. Here's a book, you know? And so there's harm and violence in those assumptions of not believing in students, right? And that could be through stereotypes, that could be through cultural interactions with like parents even. It could be the ways that in dorm rooms, you know, maybe POC students will be policed around the smell of their food, around the smell of their products, right? Like that interpersonal thing that happens between two people that in some way causes additional stress or harm or labor on the person. And then there's the system of it, right? Like the whole system, that's like the thing at the top, which is gonna be things like institutional policies that go all the way to like gerrymandering and redlining. So the ways that neighborhoods are built and constructed around voting zones, and then in turn housing zones, and the fact that most of the public education system in the United States is based off of property taxes. So what's unfortunate is that you start to see people that can afford better homes can therefore contribute more money to their schools, and therefore those students receive better access to resources, and vice versa. People that cannot afford as nice homes, who do not offer as much in property tax, have poorer or less resourced schools, and therefore not as many opportunities to receive quality education and resources. So the system of it, as big as it can be, like voting, right, in this country, impacts on the smallest levels, like snacks in school. Like one of the things that we can start to do is make sure that littles, as little as kindergarten to third grade, are getting the nutrition that they deserve, right? That is something that has been proven to like help a lot of things. It's like making sure that littles are receiving proper nutrition so that they can pay attention, so that they can learn better, so that they can be present, and so that their little bodies can do what they need to do. And then this is messed up because I've done this rabbit hole plenty of times, but it's said that depending on the study, it's somewhere between your standardized testing, either depending on the study, in third, fourth, or fifth grade will determine your likelihood of going to college. That's seriously messed up, right? So then you start pulling all these things together, like nutrition in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. If you're not at the kind of school that's resourced and all you're getting is like those crumbly granola bars, right? Versus like getting a meal with like fruit and vegetables and whatever, and you can't pay attention and you're taking a standardized test, which is like a whole nother conversation, then there is harm in that it's already determining how well you're going to do in 10, 15, how well you're going to do. That's also messed up. There's also some like notions around like education and success being the only thing. But fortunately, my work does have to do with education. My master's is in higher education, and that's where I am. So I see a lot of this stuff through the lens of education. And while I don't think that's the most successful route, I do think it's a meter of access to resources and opportunities. Yes, so there's that. So there's like all of the harm that's happening, the different levels of it, right? The physical harm, the interpersonal harm, and the institutional harm. The way that I see us responding to it, I don't know. I think I'm in the middle of trying to figure that out. So I had mentioned that I come from a family of curanderas, and that I'm in the middle of working through, like right fresh in the middle of working through this idea of a curandera feminism. So I thought it would be something like a Chicana feminism, to inform institutional change, feminist institutional change. So when I think about Chicana feminism, I'm thinking about the ways, I had to learn about it. So I had to learn about the ways that Chicana feminism as a whole. So if feminism says that like gender is the most important thing, right? That's very reducing the language. Whereas Chicana feminism is going to come in and start thinking about the ways that, Chicana, ending in an A, is already at a critique of the patriarchy of the Chicano movement. So Chicana feminism came in stark opposition to the Chicano movement. So when we think about the liberation, or even the identity of Chicano at all, because it's a really incredibly political, anti-establishment political movement, that in its movement was unfortunately grasping at tools that it witnessed, which is often like patriarchy and like hierarchy and subordination, right? To do it. And that's like the classic, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. But the longer quote says, it will beat them for a bit, but it won't work in the long run, right? I'm totally like reducing that language, but that's what the longer quote says. It basically says it might work for a bit, but it won't work forever. And that to me is the like perfect case of the Chicano movement. It was like, yeah, it got some sense of liberation, it got some sense of identity, and some justice for visibility and representation, but it reestablished a lot of gender binary, gender hierarchy stuff, and subordination of Chicanas. And so Chicana feminism was kind of this opportunity to be able to see the ways that women, Chicanx people, were being impacted directly. So a lot of this advocacy had to do with gendered violence, sexual violence, reproductive justice and reproductive violence, stuff around class, right? A lot of it was specific around that identity. So when I started looking at that, I was like, okay, this might be it. But as I was reading more work, I think I always come back to me and my family. I come back to the brilliances that I learned before I was a first generation college student, when I was first learning about justice from adults that never went to college, a lot of adults that only had 1 to 3 years of school at all. Like my paternal grandmother, she only had 1 year of school because she couldn't afford the pencil that she was required to take. But she learned enough to teach herself how to read and write, and then raised babies that are amazing, right? And so I know that justice exists outside of education. I know that brilliance and knowledge and doing things exists outside of education. And one of those brilliances is the fact that my matrilineal lineage, so my mom's mom and my mom's mom's family, are curanderas. So curanderas are healers, like natural healers, specifically like kind of like a indigenous Mexican healing. And so through medicines and through cures, cures, curandisma, and even that, I always thought it was curandisma because it's only women. As I started learning about it, the texts all say that it's curandismo, that everything is curandismo, curandero. I didn't even know that was a word. Like, obviously it is, but when we think about how we know things in our family, is that not true as well? Like, you know, when I look up stuff, it always corrects it to curandismo. Like, did you mean curandismo? And I'm like, no, because I'm talking about this thing that has to do with my grandma. So when we think about that same critique of like, we know stuff and we don't need to wait for the institution to affirm that, is the same thing that I want to use to critique the institution. So how I got there, like the origin story of a curandisma feminism at all, or a curandera feminism, at all already starts to inform the work that I'm hoping to do within institutions, which is how do we lean on the knowledges that exist outside of it? That if the institution is a master's tool, which I believe it is, or a master's house, how can we look for things that aren't the master's tools? We have to go outside of the institution. And for me, that's curandera feminism. Overall, my family comes from a curandera lineage that focuses on curas de susto, which is like cures for trauma, cures for scare and fear. And the two biggest tenets of those is to one, stop the trauma, stop the hit, stop the harm, stop the injury, like stop it from happening and address it and name it as such. And the second one is to address the lasting harm from that trauma. So that's very minimally what kind of my familial understanding of curas de susto are and our specialty in curandisma. And so when I think about that for the institution, the work gets broken down into those two areas. One, stop the harm and name it as such. We cannot stop a harm unless we are ready to name it. We can't, yes, we have to name harm that occurs, whether it's racism, sexism, sexual assault, classism, coloniality, whatever it is, we have to know what it is and we have to name it. And it's not going to stop until we name it. And the second thing is we have to actually address the long lasting harm that comes from that. We have to be able to see wide enough to see all of the rubble that happened from the hit. There is a hit, and then there is rubble, and then there is dust, and then there are people on the boundaries of that. And how do we have a big enough lens to see all of it and address it? So that is kind of what I am working through right now to figure out how would a curandera feminism respond to or elicit feminist institutional change.
Wow. I just feel like I need a second to process that. But it was really, I'm just amazed, Carina, because every time like I was like hearing what you're saying, and then I would like have a question that like would come up in my mind, like, oh, I'm wondering about that, and then you would like dive into talking about it, and I was like, oh wow, that happened like about I think 3 times just in that last bit. And so I was like, yeah, and you took the conversation exactly where like my mind was curious. I was like talking about curandera feminisms and how you said the master's tool, which an institution cannot or can't dismantle the master's house, but also and so like the curandera feminism lens can definitely, I can see it like changing and informing like a broader depth of change, or like a deeper depth of change. Like we're looking deeper into and then addressing like what harms. That was all me kind of like processing externally, but it's in here and I'm thankful for it. I guess just going from that, I'm curious about like what are the practices of curandera feminisms, like what those practices be. And I hear like a lot of accountability, like needing to name and to like bring back together the rubble and the dust that has been spread out. But I was wondering what you think are the practices of that feminism in particular.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I want to gather my thoughts because I haven't really spoken about this yet, because like you're asking me a question that like I'm thinking about right now. I'm at the cusp of the space between my exams and my dissertation, and so I'm waiting on feedback for my latest exam where I first explore this. So the answers that you're getting feel very like generative even for me, or like the questions that you're asking feel really generative. And they simultaneously, the reason I'm pausing or thinking is because I'm flooded with so many possibilities. Like the thing is I don't feel stuck. I feel excited to figure out how I have seen curandisma and cures and limpias and practices being used my whole life, and like what they mean, and how that can translate to the institution. So it's like there's just so many possibilities in my brain that there's like a million things happening. So some of the things I guess that I will share two things. I also, and this wasn't your question at all, but this is also something that came up towards the end of my thinking. So I just took an exam where I answered this question. What would a curandera feminism need to be to respond to institutional harm and injury? So like I spent 60 pages answering the question. One of the things towards the end that I wrestled with was like, you know, at the end, you're supposed to say like, what are the limitations of my work or whatever. And I said all that. And then I wrestled with, maybe for like a paragraph or two, this idea of like, how do I share this in a way that doesn't get retaken or like colonized or like re-owned or whitewashed by the institution? Some of these things that feel really like private and sacred. I'm excited because it like energizes me, but I'm like, who's gonna pick this up and take this without my consent, without my people's consent, without my family's consent, right? Without my grandma's consent, literally, right? Like, and I'm like, I should call her right now before I answer this question. But I think there are two general ideas about curandisma that are like regularly accessible that I think I can translate. So I wanted to say that as a little caveat of like, I don't know what that looks like yet. And I do believe that there are other like indigenous scholars wrestling with similar things, like ideas around not everything belongs to research. Some of it belongs to us. So there are two things that I think of. So one are like limpias, and I'll explain what those are, or baridas, kind of similar, kind of different, but I'll explain what they are. And then like a call and response kind of thing. So again, curandisma is a relationship to land, a relationship to body and spirit and spirituality. It is adjacent to brujeria, right? To like working with the elements and working with the land to create peace with the body and spirit, right? So one of the things that you can do, so that first element, limpias and baridas. So my understanding, if I can translate them correctly, to honor them is like a limpia is a cleaning of some sort, a cleaning, a wiping away, like that's the direct translation, but it's a kind of ritual that cleans or wipes away. And a barida, if I understand correctly how to translate it, is like, this sounds like it's not going to work well, but it's kind of like this idea that's like a bewitching of an object to act as a communicator device, kind of. And so usually it's like eggs or leaves or something that you can read. So basically you do a scanning with this, or you speak with it, and then you read it, right? And then you read it. So those two things can be very similar, can seem very similar. And then the other one, which are chants, are like often like blessed calls and responses to try to recall the body and the spirit together. Okay, so it's like a lot of call and responses stuff of like the person who's healing and the person who needs healing. They'll say things back and forth to each other. Okay, those are the two things that I think generally are accessible by general knowledge. So when I think about the institution, what does that look like? When I think about the institution, I think about the scanning, right? Like not just assessing harm in those particular ways that we first go to. Sexual assault through the Title IX office, you know, like, I don't know, racism through this like particular center. That's where we always go. But what would it mean to actually do a scan of the university and say, how are every corner of the institution? How can we more deeply and intimately know this institution and be ready to take on that burden? And a lot of things institutionally that come to mind are like, we don't have time for that. Well, why not? Well, we don't have people to do that. Well, why not? Hire them. Like, as somebody who studies institutions, my master's degree is in higher education, is like the biggest thing I've learned is where you put your money in your calendar says a lot about you. So your money, hire people then. Defund things that don't need that much funding and fund things that do. It's not that we don't have the money, it's that you're not prioritizing it enough. So it would depend on the fact that you would need to prioritize it okay, if we need to do the scan of the institution to understand where all of the harm exists, to be able to name that harm, it could be harm that we don't even know yet. Like it could be harm that has been lingering because there's a chair in a department that, said this thing and it has lasted, right? Like if we don't know where those are, we are fake. We are fake. If we're standing at the top of the institution and we're like, we got work to do, or like, which is great, we do. But if we're like, we're going to be a great institution, right? And we got people doing stuff in the inside that can't speak to that, we're not ready, right? So the scanning, this idea of things in place, right? This like the barida aspect, like things in place to capture those things, like where feels good and safe for people to go to. So that might look like not an institutional like way of tracking bias incidents, but maybe it's that we invest in tiny cohorts of the institution to be cared for at a diversity, equity, and inclusion level. That way somebody knows, like, it's not just like the institutional office of whatever that is going to take care of me. It's Shaina. Like, Shaina is my person for this like 20 to 30 group of people, and that's who I know to go to if something happens, right? So kind of like this marker to capture that harm. That's how I can see that kind of informing it. And the other piece of the ritual is to speak some of this, right? Is to name it, to say it out loud, to say our needs, and to ask that our community responds to that. There was just a post today, I believe, that Oregon State University posted about a memorial after the verdict from the Derek Chauvin case. And it was asking for like a memorial for like people to attend. And it specifically named police brutality in it. And I looked at the comment section, which you should probably never look at the comment section because they're gonna hurt. And they hurt, right? Like, it's like, it was a lot of people who were like, as alum of this institution, blah, blah, blah. Like people who are basically anti-Black Lives Matter, like anti-Black, right? Like anti-Black, pro-police violence. Like, I don't even know how to name that in words, but we have to name it because that's the important part. So part of it is like letting that shit breathe though. I have no intention of squashing that. I have every intention of letting it breathe, let it be said, let it be known, and say, actually, this is the community that we stand for. And it doesn't sound, you're right. It doesn't sound like you stand with us. That's cool. You're not a part of this institution then. Because I think so often we're afraid that we're going to do the right training that gets everybody on board. It's like, no, some people have to be fired. Some people are not good for the body. Some people have to go. Some people have to go. There's going to be a point, like in a lot of cures, like you don't like identify the thing that is harmful and like, well, hopefully the thing that's harmful learns. Like, no, you get rid of it, you release it, you let it go. Things need to be let go. And curanderas and birth workers are so good at letting things go. And women are so good at letting things go. You know, it's just amazing. It's like such a feminist thing to like let things breathe, let it go. If it doesn't work, let it go. Loyalty is not more important. Loyalty to a human who's being violent is not more important than like identifying our values of care for an institution.
Carina, we've had some amazing conversations on Still We Persist, and I don't think we've ever had one that makes me want to ask so many questions. I do want to respect your time. Like, I know you are giving your time and energy to lots of people and things. So Mia, do you want to ask? Do we have time for one or two more questions?
I do. So it's up to the two of you or how many questions that you have, but I have the full hour mark. So
okay.
You're welcome.
Mia, I'll concede to you then.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, Shaina, since you also mentioned that you had so many questions, I'm curious to hear what one of them is, if you want to share.
Sure, yeah. We hadn't talked about this, Carina, with you when we were kind of planning out what we wanted to say on here, but I am thinking about, so you and I are in the same PhD program in WGS. You were a couple years ahead of me, right? You're in your third year and I'm just starting, but I've had some of my students ask me how I got into a graduate program, what it's like to teach. Like, I get a sense that for undergrads, like I remember being an undergrad, graduate school seems very mystifying. There's kind of a veil between these 4 years of doing a bachelor's program and then how you decide what you want to do in grad school and get in and all that. So I think that that sort of mystery can discourage students who might be interested in formal education, and we're probably on the same page that formal education isn't the only way to do what you want. But is there something that you would want our students or other undergraduates to know when they might be part of a marginalized group who aren't encouraged to go into grad school?
Yeah, I want them to know everything. Yes, because I think informed options are the greatest way, like informed opportunities, right? Like for people to know that it feels accessible so that they can make the choice to go or to not to go. But if they don't know, and I think unfortunately, so much of graduate education feels like a veil, like that word, a veil, specifically to keep away, is purposeful. Like is purposeful. Is like it's elitist, it's classist, it's racist, and there's I don't remember what I'm thinking of it, but there's this notion that like one of the tools of power is secrets, right? So it's like locker room talk. It's like, well, why did it happen behind closed doors? Because it's a secret, right? Like all that, like power thrives off of secrets, and so that's what's happening. Is like higher education, or like graduate school, graduate and beyond. Feels very unobtainable purposefully, like it's part of this thing. And so I spent some time during my PhD experience sharing on Instagram, for example, like at every turn I'm like, this is what I'm doing in my PhD program in case you want to do it, because I have a lot of littles in my life. I come from a really big family, and I have little cousins that I want to see it, or I have students who've taken my classes, undergrad students who take my classes, who follow me, and so I want them to know, and also so that it doesn't feel so alone. So the other thing is, like, not only is it alone, is that it feels lonely, right? So I guess some of the things that I would tell people, because I want to complain is what I want to do right now. Shaina, your question makes me want to complain about the process. For example, like there's so many parts of academia that feel like it's alone. And I think that's what feels really daunting. It's like you see one person's name on an article, or you see one person as a professor, but that person, unless they're like an absolute dirtbag of a human, have a whole community of people holding them, have a whole community of people texting them, writing with them, checking their stuff, working with them, calling them, crying with them, sitting with them, drinking with them, playing video games with them, hiking with them. They have a whole team of people holding them together. And everybody's just like holding each other together. If you don't have nobody in your corner, I would not trust that person. Like if somebody's like, I did this by myself, red flag, red flag. So my biggest thing with telling students of color, marginalized students, whoever it might be, about going into college is find people who care. Find people who care. That is it. That is basically it. It's like if you can, find people who look and sound like you. And look and sound like you isn't just like any person of color, but it's like who sound like you feels important too. Like who, it's so difficult because what I want to say isn't fair to a lot of people. My understanding is that marginalized people can echo power, and it's often for survival. So I think that's why it's unfair. What I was about to say is like, I do understand that there are people of color and women who participate or practice or echo whiteness or patriarchy or classism as survival, because they don't actually benefit the way that like white people do and men do. So that's difficult. But if you could find people that even in their office hours or in the classroom or whatever, feel and sound and look like you, right? My chair is Dr. Patty Duncan. I love Dr. Patty Duncan because she sounds like me. She's hesitant. She sounds like people I love. She loves how my family loves, right? All those things. Like I love that about her. That's what you need to find. You need to find people who are going to care about you, because at the end of the day, the institution does not care about you, but you can find people who do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're lucky to have faculty who genuinely care about us, and it does feel like a family the way that most other departments I've been in do not. And I'm glad you've talked throughout our conversation about the decisions you've had to make, how you're still trying to figure things out. And one thing that I didn't realize before I started grad school in WGS was like, you don't have to have everything decided the moment you step onto campus. Like, you are constantly figuring things out with the people who are supporting you. Like, they're helping you work through these decisions. And I tell my students, like, I am kind of making a lot of things up as I go. It's not like this like straightforward process. We're not omniscient people at all. So thank you so much for talking about like your kind of your work as a grad student and how you're learning as you go on.
Yeah, thank you. I will say one last thing just in response to something you said, and I want to share a quote with you, just in case, because I feel like it feels helpful to where this conversation has landed just more recently. So one, this idea of like not knowing what I'm doing, it's like, well, duh, you haven't done it before. That was the biggest thing coming out of my most recent concentration exam, is like the anxiety and the imposter syndrome, like feeling like I don't belong, I'm not good enough, is like, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know what I'm doing. And after I was on my concentration exam, I was like, oh, of course I didn't know what I was doing. I'd never done it before. Like, that is so silly of me to like think that I didn't know how to do it. Like, well, duh, that's a part of it. It's like a part of the exam process isn't just to test me. It's like to be like to work out a muscle you've never done before. Like, to do it. Just you do it. Just as a part of it. It's like, now that you did it, you've done it, and now like it's no longer your first rodeo, right? Like it's cool, you got it. And then the quote is actually the quote that I opened up my exam with. That's that I was starting to speak to towards the end, that I was reminded of, and then just reaffirmed when Shaina was speaking. So the quote is from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and the quote says, "The university will use me alive and use me dead. The university does not intend to love me. The university does not know how to love me. The university, in fact, does not love me, but the universe does." And so the idea is that we have all these people in the universe to love us, and we don't have to depend on the institution in that way.
Yes. And I think that love and having people in your circle, in your corners, people who care, that's directly working against white supremacy culture. And that's something we were talking a little bit, or had an article on, and Shaina and another person from Aya like brought up a white supremacy cultural article through our newsletter. And yeah, individualism is a big cornerstone of upholding that culture. And I see it like, oh my gosh, yeah, it's like one of the roots for sure in a university type setting, university institution. Something I felt very like up until my second year, until I really started intentionally breaking that down in my undergrad. So yeah, I really felt that one. And I'm also reading This Body Is Not an Apology right now by Sonia Renee Taylor, and it's just, radical self-love, and then you can share that love with your community. And I think it's that love that's gonna like, and care, it's gonna take us into new like transformations and changes. So I just really love that you were talking about that, Carina.
Yeah, thank you, I appreciate it. I agree. I do think that love and care and tenderness can be really transformative and exhausting. And so we need to care for each other. Like, it's not easy work. It's very difficult to find each other, to love on each other, to care on each other, when so many of us are harmed by the institution. But I do believe you're totally right in naming it as like antithetical to white supremacy culture. Just like sharing what the secret process is like on Instagram so people can look at it, like existing sometimes can be what the institution needs. It might not be like tearing something down. It's just sometimes being being very fully yourself.
Mia, why don't you decide on our last question for Carina and take us through the end of the conversation?
I actually think that that's a really great place to end. But of course, Carina, if you want to share anything else, I'll welcome that as well.
I just love, I love the work that you're doing. I think it's super necessary. I think with so much going on in the world right now around injustice and violence, it's easy to say, like, why is this important, right? Why would this be important? It's award season right now, and every award season, people are like, why is award season? There's people dying. Well, it's like, well, people are dying because they don't see other people as full human beings. And sometimes award shows are great ways for us to honor people as human beings, actually, or seeing people's stories, like the fact that media teaches us a lot about the world. And when we see people of color in media, we see their stories being told, we see their humanity, we learn about them, and we can learn more. So nothing's ever too small. We don't need people to come in and change the world. We need people to stay in their lane in the best way possible. We need people to do whatever it is that they're doing. Stay in that lane. If you are a microbiology major, stay in your lane and figure out what this work looks like there. If you are on the golf team, figure out what that work looks like there. If you are in forestry, figure out what that looks like there. So whatever it is like we don't need people to come to the rescue, right? Paternalism or savior complex stuff. We don't need that. We need everybody to do their own work and know that sometimes just showing up as your full self is really transformative. I don't know how many times I've walked into a classroom and taught looking how I look, talking how I talk, as quickly as I do, with as bad a mouth as I do, with tattoos and graphic tees. And afterwards, it's always the students of color, and often women of color, who come up to me like, I never had a professor like you. You just like changed what this is my favorite class ever. It's my favorite class ever. And it's like, I didn't even know. I just like showed up that day, right? Like I didn't know anything was going to happen. So do you, it'll be great. That's my gift.
Thank you, Carina. Really appreciate you and all the words that you've shared. Also, appreciate the people who have supported you through this, your family, and who is in your corner now here at OSU. But yeah, feeling thankful, and I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I should probably say we'll go ahead and close now. Thank you all for listening. You can check out our next episode. It'll be coming out the following week. But really glad and thankful for y'all who got to tune in today too. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you to KBVR's production team for always helping us out and getting this episode out to you all. Bye, everyone.